She shot very well, this good, this rich bitch, this kindly caretaker and destroyer of his talent. Nonsense. He had destroyed his talent himself. Why should he blame this woman because she kept him well? He had destroyed his talent by not using it, by betrayals of himself and what he believed in, by drinking so much that he blunted the edge of his perceptions, by laziness, by sloth, and by snobbery, by pride and by prejudice, by hook and by crook. What was this? A catalog of old books? What was his talent anyway? It was a talent all right, but instead of using it, he had traded on it. It was never what he had done, but always what he could do.
Hey, this is Nick.
Hi, this is Stephanie.
Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where we're wrapping up Hemingway Short Story Month with Snows of Kilimanjaro. And so this one is kind of an autobiographical tale, or at least we perceive it to be so, in which his character Harry, who is dying of gangrene on a hunting trip. And essentially it kind of reads as sort of a Harry as Hemingway, Hemingway as Harry sort of blend. And one thing that we'll kind of start with is that I have I guess we both have it, Steph and I. We have an edition that has an introduction by Hemingway. And there's two kind of sections that seem very similar. One directly written by him, and then one written in this story itself. So I'll read the first written by him, first from the short story. It's, "Then he started to cry. That was one story he had saved to write. He knew at least 20 good stories from out there, and he had never written one. Why?" And then if you compare this with the introduction by Hemingway itself, it's, "Now it is necessary to get to the grindstone again. I would like to live long enough to write 3 more novels and 25 more stories. I know some pretty good ones." So kind of some of the jargon, some of the flow, the way he writes seems very similar, and he's talking about kind of the same concept. So Steph, I'm kind of curious, like, to what extent do you see Hemingway in this story himself?
Right. Yeah, I definitely see similarities between Harry and Hemingway in the story. And kind of referencing the preface that you were talking about, that particular quote, I like to call out another one that I found that was pretty interesting for me, in which it says, "There was so much to write. He had seen the world change, not just the events. Although he had seen many of them and had watched the people, but he had seen the subtler change, and he could remember how the people were at different times. He had been in it, and he had watched it, and it was his duty to write of it, but now he never would." And so for me, I mean, I think, Hemingway he lived through how many wars? He was there for World War I, World War II. He was a journalist, when the Spanish Civil War was taking place. And it's just, he wrote, in a lot of his novels and a lot of his short stories are about living through this time, which just must have been, I can't imagine what it must have been like for people living through that. So I think like him saying that in this short story is basically saying like, yeah, I know what I lived through, and it's my duty to tell other people in the world and in the future what it was really like to live through.
Yeah, it's kind of
terrible wars.
Yeah, his contribution back, and really looking at his entire length of contributions as this character. But you could also feel Hemingway. He's writing this, I think it's the late 30s. We determine?
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Yeah, so Hemingway's not at the end of his life himself, but it's almost he's giving his own prophecy for what it looks like as somebody who's looking back on their entire career. So you almost get the impression that he sort of fast forwards into the mindset that you could see an older Hemingway having. And I kind of just love that he's capable as a younger writer of hopping forward in time for sort of that perspective of what it feels like to be, tired and worn out and super judgmental of your own output. And it's just, it feels very, very authentic in a way of an artist just critiquing himself, but also, like you said, contributing to just the documentation of all of these historical events.
Yeah, you're right. For being younger, it's maybe he was trying to tell himself, like, look, maybe writing is difficult, or maybe there's these things that I don't want to write about, or I tell myself, it's procrastination. Oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it the next day. But, the things that I've been through, it's my duty to write these things so that other people know about them. So maybe he, that's pretty mature of him to be writing something like this in the short story, to be like, I need to get over it and write it.
Yeah,
Like-
and all the things that you still had to write, eventually you just get gangrene and you
Yeah,
actually
or-
don't get
yeah.
a chance to.
Or shit happens, and yeah, you just can't do it.
I was rereading this before we started recording, and I realized one of my favorite exchanges is kind of on that topic. So picturing Hemingway being a little bit younger, but the character Harry starts and he says, "It's a bore," he said out loud. "What is, my dear? Anything you do too bloody long." And you're like, oh my God, that's what this whole thing is about, right? It's just like
That could be akin to writing,
Yeah.
as a profession or
anything,
Yeah.
and whatever your career is, whatever. I mean, it shows him going through multiple relationships as he's sort of viewing his life in reverse. He's got kind of this collected, just weight of it all. And like, how simple of an idea is that, yeah, anything you do too bloody long is a bore.
right. Yeah.
What do you do to change that? How can you change it?
Yeah, that's what's great about Hemingway too, his ability to take, very simple sentences like that, and it encompasses so many different things. It just gives you so many different things to think about and different aspects of your life that it touches that he probably, didn't mean for it to, or I don't know, maybe he did. That's what makes him a great writer, right?
Yeah.
That so many people can relate to what he says.
And I also want to touch on another one of my favorite chunks of writing from this. And this kind of, as you said, like it sort of has the ability to touch you, but it also shows how simply and how kind of almost repetitively he can like use his compact prose style. And so I'll read it and then we can talk about it. So it starts, "So he said to himself, we did well to stop the quarreling. He had never quarreled much with this woman, while with the women he had loved he had quarreled so much that they had finally, always, with the corrosion of the quarreling, killed what they had together. He had loved too much, demanded too much, and he wore it all out." And that last chunk, that's just "he wore it all out" is like so perfectly Hemingway. You're just like, man, that's like
That's
a
what I was gonna
real
say.
statement. You nailed it. But also like that, think of any other writer who uses the same word like 6 times in 4 sentences. You'd kind of be exhausted by it. You'd be like, there's like a thesaurus over there. You could have picked something different.
You can't quite pull this off.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's one dude who can do it. But like for this, you're just like, man, you sort of just, there's a rhythm to it, and you sort of feel like both exactly what he's saying, and he's got the Hemingway punchline, but it's also got kind of the like actual repetitive feeling of what it's like to go through these relationships and these common things that tie them together, the fighting that always happened when you were passionate, and then at the end you were just too tired.
Yeah, it just wore you out. But yeah, it's interesting because you can relate that to, or it's very similar to Hemingway in general, right? Because he's repetitive in his themes as well. I mean, like you were saying,
True.
like the amount of relationships that he has, or different relationships in his short stories and novels, and then, drinking is always a theme in any of for anything I've written or excuse me, read. Yeah, that I've read.
We're also drinking right now, which is why sometimes we confuse ourselves with Hemingway.
Yes, that is very true.
It happens.
We have to be drinking and discussing Hemingway. There's no other way. But yeah, it's because his themes are so repetitive. And like you said, for many authors, that might become a bore, or you would say, there's other things in life to write about. But for Hemingway, it just doesn't seem to grow old as fast as you think it would. Yeah, with his writing.
It still hits the spot. And I think it's also worth mentioning the structure of this is kind of this interleaved sort of flashback where Harry himself is sort of going through the stories that he wished he still had time to tell. And it gives this kind of amazingly fluid kind of transition between the present time, in which he's kind of loosely hallucinating, kind of daydreaming, and going back to some of these historical perspectives that you mentioned. And I think just from a structural standpoint, it's actually really intelligent, especially towards the end when he kind of has his final daydream that isn't really set up in the same way, but when he imagines that he's being picked up, that the plane is coming, that he's kind of being rescued in time. And you kind of realize that was like the last fever dream, because the paragraph later, he's dead.
Right.
He's passed on.
But what's great is that you're sucked into that fever dream, because at the time you don't know that it is a fever dream while you're reading it, right? I mean, because you don't. Hopefully you've read the short story as you're listening to this, so we didn't give anything away.
Yeah.
But
I think, I mean, it was just like top 3 ones that people typically reference. So maybe we're okay.
I think it's
but
very
reverse
popular.
spoiler alert in case you're listening to
Right.
this now. But I also was thinking about this as like, So you have these stories within a story, and then he almost, like you said, he kind of tricks the reader, because as he sets up these flashbacks, they're very clear. They're broken up. They're in italics. It weaves in and out. But just the ability to kind of play with that, as you, like you said, you get a couple paragraphs in, you're like, wait, is this really real? Are you really being rescued? It's almost, I mean, he's kind of just adjusting his form of the story as he goes. And I'd also probably like to note that this is our second time taping this podcast on Snows of Kilimanjaro. So it's kind of like there's a podcast within a podcast, just like there's sort of the stories within a story here. So maybe there's like an extra level of meta-ness.
That's very deep.
That he probably predicted because of, again, the prophetic nature of this.
I could see that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put it,
It's in there.
Put it past him there. Yeah. But yeah, those flashbacks were very interesting. I think a lot of those, my guess or my theory is that they felt like they were straight from his diary quite often. And that, there was one in particular that I found enjoyable, was when Harry, the character, was, he was trying to console himself with, he was actually with a prostitute because he had quarreled with his true love, who he wore it all out with his true love. So this is how he went about filling that, the loneliness.
It happens.
Right. And so anyway, he's going about his business, and he's at a bar, and he ends up in a pretty violent fight with a British gunner outside. And then, he runs away with the prostitute after getting into the fight because the cops are coming, spends the night with her. And it was just, you could just see that coming straight from Hemingway's life. And the particular quote that was part of that was, he had sold vitality in one form of another all of his life. And to me, that's what Hemingway did all of his life, and anything that he was doing, whether it was writing or drinking or, I don't know, all the bullfighting in Spain. His writing about that stuff.
Yeah, he's like a lifestyle brand.
Right. That's a very good way to put it. Yeah.
Should we transition that topic of lifestyle brand to kind of the kind of question around this with his Kilimanjaro and the leopard in the beginning as he sets it up?
Right. Yeah. Do you want to read the quote, the beginning quote?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
So before the story, before he gets into the story, there's kind of this quote in italics at the beginning, and it says, "Kilimanjaro is a snow-covered mountain, 19,710 feet high, and is said to be the highest mountain in Africa. Its western summit is called the Masai. Ngaje Nga, and apologies for mispronunciations there, the house of God. Close to the western summit, there is the dried and frozen carcass of a leopard. No one has explained what the leopard was seeking at that altitude." So here's the question. What does that mean?
Right. It seems so. When you read it at the beginning of the novel, I wondered, I was like, is this part of this short story, or is it left over from the other one? Did I miss something? But yeah, once you read the novel, the short story, and at the end, when you find out that Harry dies, to me, I was like, well, is Harry the leopard? Or, what was Harry, and if Harry was the leopard, what was he really searching for?
At that altitude.
Right. Yeah. What was there for him? Like, why do those things? Or why? Yeah.
Yeah. It seems, I read it as Harry is the leopard, and no matter what heights he tried to reach, it was never going to work anyway. And that's just where he ended up. But there's also kind of this like Hemingway cockiness, right? So it's kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm stealing this a little bit from the portrayal of Hemingway in Midnight in Paris. Although I guess we're not really supposed to talk about Woody Allen anymore. But I remember liking that film when it came out. But Hemingway being that sort of masculine, competitive, whatever, he's sort of saying that, look, I didn't make it, but look at this altitude that I made it to. Only somebody of my caliber would have been seeking something this high, because all the other leopards that died, they just they're down at the bottom. But like, I'm at the top, and this is A, the heights I made it to, but B, it's also pointless and nothing in life really matters.
But it mattered to you.
That's true, right?
Because you got there, and therefore it does matter. I don't know. Yeah. If it matters to you, then it matters.
Because ultimately we're all frozen leopard carcasses.
Exactly.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
But so one other thing I noticed about this, and I was looking for other connections between that sort of lone intro paragraph and the rest. But he actually mentions Kilimanjaro during that end kind of fever dream. And so, he's
right.
Right.
They're flying, and he's like, we're taking the wrong path, and they end up going to Kilimanjaro, correct?
Yeah, so it says, and Campi turned his head and grinned and pointed, and there ahead, all he could see, as wide as all the world, great, high, and unbelievably white in the sun, was the square top of Kilimanjaro. And then he knew that was where he was going. And so it kind of like wraps it back, and I didn't fully comprehend that the first time. I guess probably didn't pay enough attention to connect those two. But it's both the, maybe the bleaker outlook of yes, you will die at these heights even if you do make it to these heights. But the end is kind of almost triumphant in a way, right? It's this, again, it's a fever dream, but he's viewing this like grand, majestic destination that he's reaching. And so I kind of left with, I don't really actually have an answer for which one it is. And I think that sort of falls into the beauty of the ambiguity that he so much wraps around in a lot of his short stories, which we've kind of addressed a couple different versions, but he likes to leave a little bit of it open for interpretation. Right. Yeah. And I just, I was trying to, I think when I read it, I think for me, when he was, is when I was likening the leopard to Harry, and then, ending up on Mount Kilimanjaro. I thought, he would, it kind of in the short story, he was coming to terms with different things in his life, right? Like I remember him, he hated the lady that he was with, but then he started thinking more about it from a more mature standpoint, saying, we're actually pretty good for each other. We're a little bit older in life, and, there's good and bad to every relationship, right? But I'm coming to terms with that, and I don't need to be a total asshole all the time in this relationship because she doesn't deserve that. Yeah. Although he still tries to. Oh, of course. Yeah. It's Hemingway, right? So him coming to terms with that relationship. I think there were a few other things that are kind of escaping me right now, but yeah, him just coming to terms with the different things in his life, and the more that he did and the more he came to peace with himself, the further up the mountain he would get. You know what I mean? Like that was kind of like when you're at total peace with yourself in death, you're at the top of Mount Kilimanjaro per se. Yeah. And then you can expire. Exactly. Because you've reached it. Right. Yeah. Oh. That's the. And maybe that's epitome of. Maybe that's where we just let this podcast expire.
Ultimately, we're all frozen leopard carcasses.